The fires in the smoking sea had already begun their slow burn into memory when whispers of Valyria's fall echoed across Essos. The city of splendor, which had dominated the known world with its shimmering towers of fused stone, had been reduced to ash and smoke. Great dragons once ruled by proud dragon lords lay lifeless in the rubble of that greatest civilization. But not all scions of the Valyrian freehold perished in the doom. A handful of families, cunning or fortunate or both, had foreseen the oncoming disaster, or at the very least heeded strange portents that compelled them to flee for safer lands. House Targaryen was the most storied of these survivors, establishing itself on the distant Isle of Dragonstone, biding its time until Aegon the Conqueror would later set foot on Westeros. But in this new telling, House Targaryen was not alone in bearing dragons away from the crumbling empire. Two other Valyrian families of renown, House Maegor and House Ealar, managed to escape the doom and safeguard their own fire-breathing beasts. In the old freehold, House Maegor had been known for its ties to the lesser magics rumored to linger in the depths of Valyria's volcanic caverns. Their sigil had shown twin dragons entwined, one black and the other a deep purple, set against a field of gray. Even among Valyrian dragon lords, the Maegors inspired awe, for they had a peculiar bond with their dragons that many considered dark or foreboding. Their mount of greatest fame was an ancient Wyrm named Umbraxis, known for its formidable black scales and unnatural longevity. House Maegor's patriarch, Orion Maegor, had dreams that shattered his sleep, dreams he claimed were sent by the Lord of Light himself or by some malignant spirit of the earth. In these dreams, he beheld Valyria's pride consumed by roaring flames and tremors that split open the ground. Because of these haunting visions, the Maegors quietly prepared ships, outfitted them in secrecy, and when the first signs of catastrophe came, a roll of thunder in the night, a shriek of wind that smelled of brimstone, they departed. It was said that they sailed under cover of darkness, the thunder of distant volcanoes propelling them onward. House Ealar held a different reputation. Where the Maegors were secretive and rumored to delve in esoteric practices, House Ealar was famed for its artistry and scholarship. They had built great libraries and filled them with scrolls on the genealogies of dragons and men, the craft of forging Valyrian steel, and the arcane symbology that wove through the city's culture. Their holdings in Valyria had been near a sea-fed lake, and they were known for extravagant feasts and gatherings to celebrate knowledge. House Ealar's symbol featured a pale dragon with eyes like starlight, poised before a golden moon. Their dragons were often smaller but exceptionally agile, known for speed and cunning in battle. The head of House Ealar was a scholar named Seren Ealar, who obsessed over the smallest details of rumor and legend. While House Maegor fled because of Orion's prophecies, House Ealar fled because Seren identified unorthodox alignments in the sky and discovered evidence in arcane texts suggesting that Valyria's doom was at hand. Convinced that an unholy cataclysm was imminent, he put his kin and dragons on ships that were lightly built but swift, sailing westward in search of a new destiny. In this telling of history, neither House Maegor nor House Ealar arrived in Westeros immediately. Their departures were fraught with storms and uncertain alliances. Some fled east and then north, circling around the broken arm of Dorne. Others sought refuge in the Basilisk Isles, while some were drawn to the same rumor that had led House Targaryen to Dragonstone, that in the western seas there lay an unclaimed dominion awaiting those bold enough to seize it. So it was that when Aegon Targaryen eventually began his conquest of Westeros, the Targaryens were not the only dragon lords to cast covetous eyes upon the Seven Kingdoms. The progeny of House Maegor and House Ealar had grown strong in the shadows, forging alliances with merchant princes of Essos and shaping armies of their own. The seeds of conflict were planted the moment the Targaryens heard the name Maegor whispered by Lysene traders in the ports of Driftmark. Rumors told of a black-sailed ship patrolling the waters near the Stepstones, its sails emblazoned with twin dragons. Merchants claimed that the House Maegor had carved out a small stronghold on the coast of the disputed lands, building a fortress of dark stone reminiscent of old Valyria. Few in Westeros believed these rumors at first. It was known that only the Targaryens had survived the doom with dragons. Then again, so few in Westeros knew the full breadth of Valyrian history. Some insisted that the rumored fortress must be a Targaryen enterprise, or a mere shadow of outlaws flying false banners. Others, especially those who had gleaned bits of Essosi gossip, suspected the stories might hold more truth than the Targaryens were prepared to admit. On Dragonstone, Aegon Targaryen and his sisters Visenya and Rhaenys listened closely. The Targaryens prided themselves on containing the last pure Valyrian bloodline with dragons in the world. If others threatened that unique standing, the Targaryens' claim to the mythical and political superiority would be shaken. The notion that House Maegor or any other Valyrian house might also possess dragons was not only disturbing but potentially fatal to the Targaryen dream of conquest. Nonetheless, Aegon pressed forward with his campaign in Westeros, capturing lands from the Storm King, subduing the Reach, bending the North, the Vale, and the Iron Islands to his authority through skillful diplomacy and bursts of dragonfire. Yet the rumor persisted, whispered in taverns and repeated in coded letters among wary lords. The Targaryens were not alone in the skies. Long before Aegon's final triumph in the Field of Fire, House Ealer arrived in Westeros from an unexpected direction. Their ships landed discreetly on the shores of Oldtown at the invitation of the High Tower, a paternal figure in House Hightower who believed that forging a tie with these second Valyrian exiles might prove advantageous. Seren Ealer, older now, his once black hair showing streaks of silver, presented himself as a man of peace and learning. He offered gifts of exotic spices from Essos, scrolls of knowledge rescued from Valyria's libraries, and, most impressive of all, the sight of a slender, moon-pale dragon circling the skies above Oldtown's harbor. The small folk gazed up in wonder, astonished to see a dragon that was not Targaryen. The maesters of the citadel were torn between awe and alarm. The Hightowers, known for their cunning, were intrigued. Lord Manfred Hightower granted House Ealer the right to settle for a time on land near the Honeywine, establishing a modest compound to house their retinue. Rumors soon spread that the Ealers harbored not one, but 3 dragons, each smaller than the Targaryen beasts but swift and cunning beyond compare. Some in Oldtown speculated that Seren Ealer sought to negotiate a peaceful existence in Westeros, far from the conflicts of Essos. Others believed he had come with an eye to forging alliances that would eventually challenge the Targaryen ascendancy. The Archmesters sought private audiences with Seren, fascinated by his knowledge of arcane Valyrian secrets. But Seren divulged very little, preferring to speak of forging trade pacts and encouraging an exchange of scholarship. He flattered the Hightowers with talk of Oldtown's grand heritage, matching it with the lost wonders of Valyria. What Seren did not reveal was a conversation he had once had with Orien Maegor in the Basilisk Isles, where they conspired to eventually carve out dominions in Westeros that would ensure the re-emergence of Valyrian rule. House Ealer would take the south, where knowledge and culture thrived, while House Maegor would steer its black-sailed ships northward, seeking vantage points from which they might challenge Aegon's rule. If conflict ensued between them and the Targaryens, so be it. As Aegon consolidated his power in King's Landing, forging the Iron Throne from the surrendered swords of his foes, Orien Maegor made the first bold strike. Under the cover of night, 3 monstrous black dragons soared over the narrow sea, belching flame upon any unfortunate ships that crossed their path. Their roar was said to chill the hearts of sailors from Lys to the Stepstones. House Maegor unleashed a sudden assault on the Isle of Tarth, known as the Sapphire Isle. The ruling Evenstar of Tarth, sworn to House Baratheon, found himself unprepared for an aerial attack from dragons not wearing the Targaryen banner. The garrison was decimated. Maegor soldiers, clad in dark armor reminiscent of Valyrian design, landed under the wings of those fearsome Wyrms. They burned the castle gates, claimed the fortress in the name of Orien Maegor, and installed a small occupying force. Orien himself arrived the next dawn atop Umbraxis, the fabled black dragon rumored to have survived the doom itself. With Tarth under his control, Orien dared the Targaryens to respond. Aegon Targaryen's fury was immediate. He dispatched his sister Visenya, riding the fearsome Vhagar, to quell this insurgent threat. But even the brazen Visenya could not ignore the swirling rumors that Umbraxis was not the only dragon in Maegor's arsenal. When she arrived above Tarth, she beheld not one but 3 dragons perched on the ramparts of the castle. Visenya's attempt to intimidate the Maegor hold with a sudden display of dragonfire turned into a stalemate of roaring beasts circling each other in the skies. Below, the castle's defenders fired bolts from scorpions, weaponry clearly of Valyrian design, aimed not just at Vagar but at any Targaryen approach. There were no illusions of a peaceful resolution. The skirmish ended with Visenya pulling back to Dragonstone to gather reinforcements. The Evenstar, imprisoned within his own castle, watched from a tower window as Umbraxus and the other black-scaled dragons roared triumph. House Maegor had declared its claim. Yet House Maegor's victory at Tarth was precarious. Orien Maegor knew that the Targaryens possessed more dragons and a unified kingdom to back them. The conquest might have been swift, but it would not be final. It was said that Orien prayed to strange gods in the depths of Tarth's dungeons, seeking visions or signs of how to proceed. With cunning, he reached out to possible allies in the Stormlands and the Reach, offering them glimpses of the power that might be shared if they threw off Targaryen rule. Word reached him that House Eler lingered in Oldtown, forging alliances through scholarship and trade rather than direct conquest. Relations between Maegor and Eler had never been truly warm. Both houses had escaped the doom, but their aspirations often clashed. The Elers prized knowledge, diplomacy, and a certain ideal of benevolent rulership. The Maegors believed power came from fear and awe, a lesson they had learned from the darkest corridors of Valyria. Still, Orien wondered if House Eler could be swayed to join him in open defiance against the Targaryens. In Oldtown, Saren Eler sat in a council chamber with Lord Manfred Hightower, who was visibly distraught by the news that dragons not sworn to Targaryen rule had seized Tarth. The Hightowers had bent the knee to Aegon in the final stages of the conquest, joining the rest of the South in pledging fealty. This arrangement guaranteed Oldtown's continued prosperity and status. Manfred knew that open alliance with House Maegor would mean challenging the full might of the Targaryens. On the other hand, harboring House Eler was already a precarious gamble. Saren spoke soothingly, his voice nearly hypnotic as he explained that Eler sought no open war, only a place to prosper. Yet even as he offered reassurance, Saren's mind churned with possibilities. House Eler did not relish war, but neither would they stand idle if the Targaryens tried to corner the market on dragon-based dominion. Saren could sense that the Targaryens would soon demand that the Elers declare themselves or leave Westeros altogether. When Aegon received word of Maegor's occupation of Tarth, he was both enraged and troubled. He called a grand council in King's Landing, inviting the great lords who had sworn fealty to him to discuss this alarming development. In the Red Keep, still partially under construction, Aegon sat on the Iron Throne while his sisters stood at his side. Lords Baratheon, Stark, Lannister, Tully, Arryn, and Tyrell gathered in tense conversation. The sight of so many lords, once proud and independent, now bending knee to the Targaryen king was a testament to the power of dragons. But would that power be questioned if House Maegor and House Eler also possessed dragons? The lords debated the threat in hushed tones. Aegon's voice was cool and measured as he explained the gravity of the situation. House Maegor, a hitherto unknown Valyrian lineage, had seized one of the crown's vassals and was rumored to hold at least 3 dragons. House Eler, another Valyrian house rumored to have dragons, was in Oldtown. How should the crown respond? Some of the lords advocated for swift, brutal action. The crown should muster its armies, summon every Targaryen dragon, and snuff out House Maegor before it grew too bold. Others argued for caution. Tarth was geographically significant but not as crucial as, say, the major ports or King's Landing itself. Perhaps sending an envoy to demand Maegor's surrender or departure would be wise. Aegon listened but appeared unconvinced by calls for negotiation. Visenya, brimming with martial pride, insisted that the Targaryens show no mercy. Rhaenys was quieter, perhaps more contemplative. She wondered aloud if House Eler might intervene diplomatically, urging the Maegors to make peace under Targaryen overlordship. The debate ended inconclusively, though it was decided that Aegon would dispatch envoys to both House Eler in Oldtown and House Maegor in Tarth. The Targaryen message was clear: bend the knee or face dragonfire. The first envoy to Tarth met with a grisly reception. Orien Maegor's men displayed the envoy's severed head on a pike above the castle gates, along with a scorched banner bearing the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. That single act declared war more openly than any letter could. The Targaryens responded by dispatching a fleet from King's Landing and Storm's End, carrying soldiers loyal to the crown and accompanied by Visenya on Vhagar and Rhaenys on Meraxes. But the crossing to Tarth proved perilous. House Maegor's black dragons patrolled the skies, and the narrow waters around the isle turned into a veritable gauntlet of scorpion bolts and flaming pitch hurled from catapults along the cliffs. Skirmishes erupted, with dragons dueling overhead, unleashing jets of flame across the sea. Aegon remained in King's Landing, believing that his sisters, each a capable dragon rider, could handle the threat. Yet the days turned to weeks, and the Targaryen forces made little headway. Tarth, once known for its breathtaking vistas of sapphire-blue seas, became a land of ash-laden beaches and twisted, burned-out ships. The Evenstar's people suffered behind battlements that were now heavily fortified by House Maegor. Meanwhile, in Oldtown, the second Targaryen envoy arrived to seek an audience with Seren Elar. This envoy came in peace, escorted by a small retinue of Targaryen household knights and accompanied by a maester who served as translator of Valyrian. They found Seren Elar presiding over an evening of scholarly debate with the local maesters, discussing the properties of dragonglass and potential remedies to certain plagues rumored to be arising in the free cities. The Targaryen demand was presented. The crown commanded House Elar to leave Westeros or swear fealty and turn over any dragons they possessed for the Targaryens' benefit. Seren listened with polite detachment, the faintest smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He asked if the Targaryens recognized House Elar's rightful sovereignty over any land they might settle with the blessing of local lords. The envoy could only respond that such matters were for King Aegon to decide, and that no arrangement would be considered until House Elar bent the knee. Seren's eyes glinted with an unreadable emotion. He did not flinch at the threat, but neither did he reject the notion outright. He said he would consider the matter carefully and send a response soon. With that, he dismissed the Targaryen envoy. A few days later, a sealed letter arrived in King's Landing stating that House Elar would not abandon Oldtown as they had been granted hospitality by House Hightower, and that they held no intention of challenging the crown so long as they were allowed to remain in peaceful scholarship. The letter pointedly omitted any mention of fealty or the Targaryens' request to surrender or share their dragons. Aegon read it, scowled, and deemed it evasive. Though the tone was not as openly defiant as House Maegor's, the refusal to bend the knee was a clear statement that House Elar considered itself an equal, if not an outright rival, to Targaryen might. King Aegon faced the very real prospect of a two-front challenge: open warfare against the Maegors in the eastern seas and a potential rivalry with House Elar in the south. As the war in Tarth dragged on, the Targaryens discovered that House Maegor's dragons, though fewer in number, were fiercely well-trained for warfare. Orien's own mount, Umbraxis, was a terror beyond measure. Its black flames could melt stone battlements, and it bore scars that suggested it had survived battles far more dangerous than any it had thus far faced in Westeros. Rumors spread that Maegor sorcery had somehow strengthened or corrupted Umbraxis, making it resistant to the usual injuries that might fell a dragon. Visenya's attempts to corner Orien in aerial combat proved fruitless. The black Wyrm was startlingly agile for its immense size, and the other two Maegor dragons coordinated attacks in a manner that hinted at dark mental bonds. The Targaryen forces found themselves struggling, even with the might of Vhagar and Meraxes. Supplies ran short, morale waned, and Visenya grew increasingly frustrated. Rhaenys, for her part, advocated a withdrawal to Storm's End to regroup, but Visenya's pride would not allow such a retreat. It was during one of these stalemates over Tarth that a third force emerged from the clouds. A sleek, moon-pale dragon. Its rider wore armor chased with gold and silver filigree in a style reminiscent of old Valyria's artistry. The watchers below saw this unknown dragon approach, flanked by two more smaller yet similarly silver-hued beasts. House Elar had arrived, though for what purpose none could immediately tell. The Targaryen and Maegor dragons paused their circling, the roars quieting to guttural snarls, as if uncertain whether to join forces or attack this new intrusion. For a single moment, A hush fell over the skies above Tarth. Soldiers in the castle courtyards and on ships at sea paused in terror and amazement. The presence of 5 dragons in the skies had become more than enough to strain the imagination, but now there were 8. It was as if the old freehold itself had come to life in the air. Riding the leading silver dragon was Seren Eler himself, accompanied by his daughter Valyria, on a smaller but no less formidable mount. They circled carefully, avoiding the scorpion bolts that the Magyar archers might have loosed. Eventually, Seren guided his dragon to a precarious landing on a cliff just beyond the castle's range. From there, he signaled for the Targaryen forces to parley. Visenya, fueled by suspicion and grudging curiosity, descended upon Vagar. Orien Magyar, for his part, remained airborne, circling overhead like a vulture waiting for weakness. On that rocky outcrop, Seren Eler and Visenya Targaryen met under a banner of truce. Seren proposed a mediated settlement. He claimed that House Eler was interested in seeing no further destruction of Westeros, a land that they hoped to make their home. He suggested that House Magyar might be persuaded to yield Tarth back to the crown if granted dominion over certain islands in the Narrow Sea and some recognition of their right to exist in Westeros without Targaryen subjugation. Visenya regarded him with open disdain, her hand close to the hilt of her Valyrian steel sword, Dark Sister. It seemed unimaginable that Aegon would grant any such concessions to a rebel who had murdered the crown's envoy. Seren shrugged, pointed out that continuing this war would only weaken the Targaryens and embolden foreign powers, including the free cities that might decide to exploit the chaos. Would not the Targaryens prefer an arrangement that preserved their hold over Westeros and avoided a protracted, devastating struggle? Visenya asked if Seren served Orien Magyar, if House Eler had come to assist in the war against the Targaryens. Seren calmly replied that House Eler served no master but its own cause. He had come to prevent the realm from descending into a cataclysmic dragon war, reminiscent of the devastation that had once overtaken Valyria. If the Targaryens and the Magyars burned each other to cinders, there would be no realm left to rule. Visenya could not entirely deny the logic of this, but her pride bristled at the suggestion that Aegon's rule was precarious. Even so, she agreed to pass along the proposal to her brother. Seren departed as swiftly as he had come, instructing Orien Magyar from the skies to hold any major attacks until negotiations had concluded. Orien, suspicious of Eler motives, nonetheless relished any additional time to fortify Tarth. Word reached King's Landing of Seren Eler's intervention, and Aegon convened another council. Reactions were mixed. Some saw a chance to avoid a protracted war that could bankrupt the kingdom and allow foreign interference. Others insisted that the Targaryens could not tolerate such insolence from upstart houses claiming Valyrian blood. Even Rhaenys and Visenya were divided. Rhaenys leaned toward negotiation, reasoning that it might be better to acknowledge the presence of these other dragonlords in a limited capacity rather than risk open war on multiple fronts. Visenya, incensed by Magyar's brutality and the memory of that severed envoy's head, urged that no compromise be made. Aegon listened to both sides. He did not fear war, having conquered the 7 kingdoms with dragonfire. Yet the Targaryens' advantage in dragons was not so overwhelming now that 2 other houses also possessed them, and the risk of heavy losses loomed large. The debate raged for days, but eventually Aegon agreed to at least hear Seren Eler's terms more concretely. So Seren arrived at King's Landing with a modest escort, including his daughter Valyria and several scholarly courtiers who radiated an air of calm confidence. The small folk, who had never seen a non-Targaryen dragon up close, gawked at the pale beast that perched outside the walls. The gold cloaks were on high alert, uncertain if House Eler had come to parley or to set the city ablaze. In the newly constructed throne room, Seren was brought before Aegon Targaryen. The contrast between the 2 men was stark. Aegon, broad-shouldered and regal in his black and red finery, wielded the authority of a conqueror. Seren, tall and lean, wore robes of shimmering silver and gold. His demeanor was scholarly, almost mild, yet his bearing suggested that he was no stranger to power. He greeted Aegon in High Valyrian, paying the respects due to a Valyrian king, yet notably did not bend the knee. This pointed omission sparked murmurs among the gathered courtiers. Aegon demanded to know why Seren sought to meddle in a conflict that had nothing to do with House Ealer. Seren replied that, on the contrary, it had everything to do with the future of all Valyrian bloodlines and the stability of Westeros. He offered a plan. The Targaryens would end their siege of Tarth, allowing House Maegor to withdraw under the watchful mediation of House Ealer. Tarth would return to the Evenstar's rule under Targaryen sovereignty, but House Maegor would be granted the right to settle a small domain in the eastern marches of the Crownlands or be given an uninhabited isle where they could maintain their seat without challenging the authority of the Iron Throne. In return, House Maegor would swear to limit the usage of their dragons to defensive needs and pledge no further aggression. House Ealer, for its part, would accept the overlordship of the Targaryens in a strictly nominal capacity, paying a symbolic tribute each year to the crown. In essence, it would be an alliance of convenience. The Targaryens would remain the paramount rulers of Westeros, while the Maegors and Ealers would be recognized as distinct enclaves, Valyrian enclaves, under Targaryen auspices. The suggestion that House Ealer would accept the overlordship of the Targaryens in a nominal capacity immediately drew laughter and jeers from some of Aegon's lords, who considered it an insult. If the Ealers truly meant to live in peace, they should bend the knee outright as every other house had. Aegon turned a cool gaze toward Seren. He did not laugh. Rather, he asked if House Ealer believed itself too proud to kneel. Seren responded carefully that the Ealers were not refusing to kneel out of pride but out of fidelity to their heritage. Valyria had fallen, and only a few threads of that greatness remained. House Ealer could not, in good conscience, simply yield all that knowledge and culture to become vassals in the same sense as houses that had never flown dragons. However, he repeated, House Ealer had no wish to contest the Targaryens' dominion. Perhaps there could be a middle ground in which House Ealer's unique identity was preserved while still acknowledging the Targaryens as the senior branch of Valyrian rule in Westeros. A hush fell over the throne room. The assembled lords looked to Aegon, who seemed unreadable. The Targaryen king closed his eyes momentarily, as if weighing the merits of open war against the benefits of compromise. Finally, Aegon spoke, proclaiming that he would not grant House Ealer's request so easily, especially while House Maegor remained in open rebellion. Yet, he conceded that if the war on Tarth could be ended without further bloodshed, and if House Maegor truly could be contained, then perhaps the Targaryens and Ealers might find a path toward mutual respect. Seren bowed lightly and offered that once Tarth was free, he would invite both the Targaryens and the Maegors to a grand conclave at Oldtown, where matters of the Valyrian heritage could be settled in a more scholarly and less bellicose fashion. This suggestion drew widespread skepticism, but Aegon merely said, "First bring me Tarth. Then we shall see." The days that followed were fraught with negotiation. House Ealer's envoys traveled between King's Landing and Tarth, bearing messages of truce. Orien Maegor, entrenched on Tarth, found the idea of bending the knee to Aegon revolting, even symbolically. He raged at the notion that they should surrender what they had won by force of arms. However, the reality of the situation was becoming stark. The Targaryens were beginning to rally larger forces from the Stormlands, and while House Maegor had proven formidable with 3 dragons, they would be hard-pressed to fight off a united Westeros. The impetus for change came when Orien's beloved son, Garren, was gravely wounded in a fiery skirmish with Rhaenys on mare axes. That incident jolted Orien into seeing how precarious his position truly was. Reluctantly, with the urging of his own advisors, Orien consented to a temporary ceasefire, allowing Seren Ealer to mediate terms. Meanwhile, in Oldtown, House Ealer prepared for what they hoped would be a crucial summit. They gathered ancient Valyrian texts on governance, draconic bloodlines, and the rights for forging alliances. Maesters from the Citadel were intrigued by the prospect of witnessing a negotiation among Valyrian dragonlords. Lord Hightower, though wary, recognized that hosting such an event could bolster Oldtown's prestige. Secretly, Seren Ealer wondered if the Targaryens and the Maegors could truly be reconciled or if this was merely a prelude to a more catastrophic clash. In his private chambers, he pored over star charts and fragments of prophecies, some partial, some contradictory, while his daughter Rhaenyra practiced with her dragon in the skies above the city. Valyria yearned for adventure, bridging the gap between House Ealer's scholarly inclinations and the fiery reality of draconic power. She asked her father why they should not just forge their own path, claiming some distant corner of Westeros by force. Saren's response was measured. Valyria had crumbled under its own hubris. If House Ealer was to survive, they must weave alliances, not simply conquer. Eventually, the day came when Orien Maegor agreed to attend the summit at Oldtown, though he demanded safe conduct and the presence of his dragons. Aegon Targaryen also agreed, though he insisted that he would come with his sisters and their dragons. The city braced for the arrival of these three houses, each capable of raining fire from the sky. The people of Oldtown spoke in hushed voices, some in wonder, others in dread. If these negotiations soured, Oldtown might become a smoking ruin. Yet in the hearts of many, a flicker of excitement burned. This would be the greatest gathering of dragonlords in living memory. Saren Ealer chose to host the talks in the wide courtyard of the citadel, a symbolic nod to knowledge-guiding power rather than power-devouring knowledge. The courtyard was large enough to accommodate the Targaryen retinue, the Maegor delegation, and House Ealer's own circle. High walls surrounded it, and the tower of the High Tower itself loomed in the distance, offering vantage points for archers if matters went awry. Each party arrived on dragonback, landing in carefully designated areas to avoid provoking immediate conflict. Even so, tensions ran high as the roars of 8 dragons echoed through Oldtown streets. The Targaryens alone brought 3 beasts: Balerion the Black Dread, Vhagar, and Meraxes. House Maegor displayed Umbraxus in all his horrifying glory alongside 2 other black-scaled dragons. House Ealer's dragons, slender and pale, arrived in an elegant sweep above the rooftops. When Orien Maegor alighted from Umbraxus, the ground seemed to tremble beneath the dragon's massive frame. Orien's visage was grim, his silver-gold hair tied back in a tight braid, his eyes cold with suppressed rage. Aegon stood at the center of the courtyard, flanked by Visenya and Rhaenys, each wearing ceremonial armor. The Targaryen banners fluttered in a faint breeze. Nearby, Saren Ealer wore robes of shimmering silver, his demeanor carefully controlled. The officiants from the citadel stepped forward, guiding the participants to a grand marble table set in the courtyard's center. There, they would attempt to broker a peace. The talks began with pointed accusations. Aegon demanded that Orien answer for the murder of his envoy and the occupation of Tarth. Orien responded by declaring that if the Targaryens had truly respected the memory of Valyria, they would have welcomed other dragonlords instead of seeking to monopolize power in Westeros. Visenya's temper flared at that. She reminded Orien that they had built the Iron Throne through conquest, not by cowering behind illusions of unity. Saren interjected with calm remarks about the necessity of forging a new era, lest the legacy of Valyria be tarnished by endless internecine warfare. Rhaenys tried to support Saren's stance, suggesting that if Westeros became a battlefield for rival dragonlords, it would only replicate the doom on a smaller scale. At every step, tension simmered. The presence of dragons just beyond the courtyard walls was a constant reminder that one false move could lead to devastation. After days of negotiations and countless heated debates, a tentative agreement emerged. The Targaryens would remain the paramount rulers of Westeros. House Maegor would cede Tarth back to its rightful lord and pay a heavy indemnity to House Targaryen. In exchange, they would be granted lordship over the remote isle known as Bloodstone in the Stepstones, along with the smaller isles surrounding it, and their domain would be recognized as a vassal state under the Iron Throne. House Maegor could keep its dragons but would pledge not to expand into mainland Westeros without royal permission. House Ealer, for its part, would accept a formal oath of fealty to Aegon Targaryen, though in practice they would retain wide autonomy in Oldtown under the Hightower's patronage. They would pay an annual tribute to King's Landing and supply a portion of their scholarly findings to the Crown's maesters. It was a fragile compromise, riddled with potential pitfalls, but it offered a way to avert a catastrophic war. The final moment of the summit was the ceremonial exchange of oaths in High Valyrian. Aegon spoke first, acknowledging that House Maegor and House Ealer held the blood of ancient Valyria and that he, as the conqueror of Westeros, would welcome them as kin under his rule. so long as they remained loyal. Orion, his voice tight with anger, declared that he would pay homage to the Iron Throne, but only so far as it did not infringe upon the sanctity of House Maegor's domain. Saren recited a fluid vow of allegiance, carefully crafted to preserve the dignity of House Eler. Thus, the Concord of Oldtown was forged, ratified by the watchful eyes of maesters and the looming presence of dragons. In the months that followed, House Maegor reluctantly vacated Tarth. The Evenstar returned to find his castle scorched but still salvageable. The Targaryen forces withdrew, and Orion sailed south to claim Bloodstone. Over time, the Maegors erected a fortress there of black volcanic rock. Their dominion in the Stepstones was harsh and often lawless, but it gave them a foothold close to the trade routes, allowing them to grow wealthy by taxing passing ships. Meanwhile, House Eler remained in Oldtown, maintaining a courteous if somewhat cool relationship with King's Landing. The Hightowers benefited from the presence of a second Dragonlord house, leveraging them to keep the Targaryens' power in check should it ever threaten Oldtown directly. The realm at large was left to wonder if the Targaryens, Maegors, and Elers would ever truly coexist in peace, or if this lull was only a prelude to an even greater conflict. Aegon Targaryen, ever aware of the precarious balance, continued to solidify his hold on Westeros. He completed the Red Keep, expanded King's Landing, and sought to strengthen ties with the great houses that had bent the knee. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew that the rise of other Dragonlords diminished some part of the Targaryens' mystique. No longer could he claim that the Targaryens were the sole keepers of draconic power. The lords of Westeros, for now, still deferred to the Iron Throne, but might some of them look to House Maegor or House Eler if dissatisfaction with Targaryen rule grew. House Maegor's presence in the Stepstones introduced a new variable in the regional politics of the Narrow Sea. They formed alliances with pirates and mercenaries, ensuring the Stepstones remained a perilous route for merchants. Some said that Orion Maegor aimed to expand his territory, eyeing the Dornish coast or even the Stormlands should the Targaryens show any sign of weakness. Orion's ambitions had not faded. His oath of fealty was perfunctory at best. Maegor warlocks, or so rumor claimed, honed dark arts beneath the basalt fortress of Bloodstone. The black dragons patrolled the skies, ever alert for an opportunity to exploit Targaryen vulnerabilities. In Oldtown, House Eler took a different path. They sponsored the construction of new libraries in collaboration with the Citadel, collecting and preserving ancient texts about Valyria and dragonlore. They provided knowledge about how to treat and rear dragons, how to forge Valyrian steel, and how to harness certain magical properties hidden in dragonglass and other substances. In return, they gained immense respect among the maesters and the scholars of Westeros, forging a network of intellectual alliances that reached even into King's Landing. Saren Eler stressed that knowledge was the key to ensuring that Valyria's mistakes were not repeated. Yet some in Eler's circle whispered of an older prophecy, one that spoke of a time when multiple Dragonlords would unite, forging a new empire even greater than Valyria. Rhaenyra Eler, now grown into a confident dragon rider, sometimes dreamed of a grander destiny than merely playing second fiddle to the Targaryens. She looked upon her pale dragon and wondered if House Eler might one day surpass the Targaryens in splendor, if not in open might. For years, the precarious peace held. Aegon aged, as did his sisters. The realm saw the Targaryens' might in practice. Many lords still knelt willingly to the Iron Throne, praising the stability it brought. Yet the murmur of discontent also grew in some quarters. High taxes, needed to fund the expansions in King's Landing and other royal projects, annoyed certain lords. The Iron Islanders chafed under Targaryen rule, as they always had. Dorne remained unconquered, an affront to Aegon's dream of a united realm. In secret, envoys traveled to Bloodstone, seeking out Orion Maegor to see if he might aid them in undermining Targaryen control. Orion, prideful and cunning, played both sides, taking coin and making promises but never openly violating the Concord of Oldtown. At least not yet. Tensions inevitably flared. A few minor lords in the Stormlands, disillusioned with Targaryen oversight, tried to break away. They foolishly thought House Maegor might lend them dragons in rebellion. When they reached out to Orion, he demanded extortionate promises in land and gold. Negotiations broke down before any formal alliance was brokered. Word of the Stormlanders' treachery reached Aegon's ears. Incensed, he moved swiftly to quell the uprising. Yet the deeper worry was that House Maegor was so brazenly courting rebellious lords. If such conspiracies multiplied, war would once again be inevitable. On the other side, House Ealer found itself in a delicate position. As the realm's discontents grew, more and more lords or knights seeking alternative alliances approached Oldtown, hoping that the more enlightened Ealers might champion their grievances. Seren, wanting to preserve peace, refused such entreaties, insisting that any dispute with the crown should be resolved through lawful channels. But Valyria, eager to prove House Ealer's worth on the wider stage, sometimes urged her father to take a more assertive stance. Why should Aegon remain unchallenged in all matters of state? She would ask, when House Ealer had proven its own capability. So the stage was set for another grand confrontation. Aegon grew older, and after many years, his mind turned to the question of succession. His heir, Aenys, was a bright but not especially forceful child. Would he be able to keep the kingdom united against the twin threats of Maegor ambition and Ealer independence? The lords of Westeros, too, began to question how stable the monarchy would remain once the conqueror was gone. Alliances were tested, and the seeds of future conflicts were sown. The first blow fell when Orion Maegor's second son, Dagon, led a raid against a Lysene merchant fleet protected by a crown-sanctioned escort. The incident occurred off the coast near the Stepstones. Dagon's Black Dragon incinerated several escort ships, seizing the cargo for House Maegor. The outraged Lysene merchants demanded that King Aegon hold House Maegor accountable. Aegon summoned Orion to court, but the Maegor lord refused to attend, claiming that the Lysene ships had trespassed on what he deemed his waters. The breakdown in relations was immediate. Aegon threatened to strip House Maegor of its domain in the Stepstones, to which Orion responded with open defiance. War clouds gathered again. This time, Seren Ealer attempted another intervention. He wrote letters imploring both sides to recall the lessons of the Concord. Orion scoffed at Ealer's entreaties, calling Seren the Targaryens' pet scholar. Meanwhile, Aegon's patience for repeated Maegor provocations was exhausted. He began amassing ships and ground forces for a renewed assault on Bloodstone, determined to put an end to the Maegor threat once and for all. The old war flared anew, but now with the possibility that it might draw in House Ealer. After all, if the Targaryens declared House Maegor traitors, the question remained, would House Ealer side with the crown or stand neutral? If House Ealer sided with House Maegor, even passively, the Targaryens might see them as enemies as well. The kingdom held its breath, uncertain whether this conflict would plunge Westeros into a full-scale dragon war. In Oldtown, Seren convened a gathering of his counselors, including Valyria. He spoke of the dire consequences if House Ealer refused to support King Aegon. The crown might well declare them complicit or suspect them of wanting to replace Targaryen rule with their own. Valyria bristled at the suggestion of subservience, but she also recognized the danger. House Ealer was not yet strong enough to face the Targaryens head-on, nor did they share the Maegor's appetite for reckless expansion. Reluctantly, Seren sent word to Aegon that House Ealer recognized the justice of the crown's cause in punishing House Maegor for attacking the Lysene fleet. They would not involve themselves in military action but would uphold the Targaryens' right to enforce their sovereignty. It was a careful statement of neutrality, leaning toward the Targaryens, but not so overt as to burn all bridges with House Maegor if the war went poorly for the crown. Aegon accepted this half-hearted allegiance, seeing it as preferable to open hostility from another Dragonlord house. He dispatched Visenya with Vagor and a sizable naval contingent to begin blockading the Stepstones. Rhaenys, now less fond of war and more inclined to remain at King's Landing, stayed behind. The rumor was that her health had begun to fade, or perhaps she had simply grown weary of conflict. So Visenya took the lead, determined to end the Maegors once and for all. The Targaryen fleet was joined by soldiers from the Stormlands and the Reach, forming a formidable armada. But House Maegor was entrenched on Bloodstone, with defenses even more formidable than those they had erected on Tarth. The Second Stepstones War, as it came to be called, erupted in flames. Dragons filled the skies, unleashing torrents of fire upon ships and fortresses alike. Visenya tried to replicate the bold strategies she had used during the conquest, diving upon the enemy with Vagar's savage might. Yet the Magers had prepared, stationing scorpions along the rocky heights, employing mercenary crossbowmen with black bolts rumored to be tipped with an unknown substance that burned dragon flesh. Umbraxis and the other black dragons fought with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned Targaryen knights. The conflict teetered on a knife's edge for weeks, as the Targaryens, despite their numerical advantages, struggled to make landfall on Bloodstone. Ultimately, Visenya succeeded in landing ground forces on a narrow beachhead. She led a fierce charge into the heart of the Mager fortress, personally slaying several of Orion's closest knights. However, in the midst of the chaos, Umbraxis and Vagar engaged in a terrifying aerial duel above the fortress spires. Soldiers on both sides looked up, too afraid to intervene as the dragons snapped at each other with jaws of steel-hard teeth, exhaling flames that lit the skies red. At one point, Vagar's flames struck Umbraxis in the flank, and the black dragon let out a roar that shook the island. The two beasts clashed, bodies slamming into one another, battered wings beating the air. In a moment that would become legend, Umbraxis lunged upward, clamped its jaws around Vagar's neck, and tore a savage wound. Visenya, seated in her saddle, nearly fell from the sky. Vagar responded with a gout of flame directly into Umbraxis' face, forcing the black dragon to release its grip and spiral away, half-blinded. On the ground, Orion Mager fought like a demon, raining arrows from a vantage point and calling on dark incantations. More than one Targaryen soldier swore they heard eerie whispers that drove men to madness in the midst of battle. Even so, the Targaryens pressed forward, hungry for victory. The final showdown came in the great courtyard of the Mager fortress, where Visenya, dismounting from a wounded Vagar, faced Orion in single combat. She carried Dark Sister, glinting red in the sun. Orion wielded a strange spear with a barbed Valyrian steel tip. The clang of steel against steel echoed across the bloody stones. Visenya's skill was unmatched in Westeros, but Orion fought with the desperation of a man who believed he was defending Valyria's last bastion. He managed to wound Visenya's shoulder, but in the end, her vicious swordsmanship triumphed. Orion fell to a thrust through the heart, cursing Visenya's name with his last breath. With Orion's death, the Mager defense collapsed. Umbraxis, injured and howling in rage, retreated to a distant crag, where it remained for a time unreachable. The Mager fortress fell, and the Targaryen banner was raised above its ramparts. The surviving Magers bent the knee if only to save their skins. Many of the black-armored knights were executed, but Orion's son Garen, wounded from his earlier fight, was allowed to live as a hostage, taken back to King's Landing to ensure Mager obedience. This decisive blow put an end to House Mager's immediate threat. They were permitted to keep their domain in the Stepstones under strict Targaryen oversight, but their power was shattered. Of their 3 dragons, one was slain outright, Umbraxis was crippled, and the third escaped to some unknown lair. Their ambitions to challenge the Targaryens for dominion were extinguished, at least for the moment. When news of the victory reached Oldtown, House Ealer breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had avoided a direct confrontation and preserved their standing with the crown. Yet Rhaenyra felt a pang of regret, wondering if House Ealer might have used this moment to assert a greater influence. Saren, reading her thoughts, cautioned patience. The time was not yet ripe. They had survived while Mager had been humbled. House Ealer now stood as the sole alternative lineage of Valyrian dragonlords not crushed under Targaryen might. In the shadowy corridors of the citadel, some whispered that House Ealer's day was coming, and that knowledge, cunning, and the blessings of time would see them rise in ascendancy. King Aegon was hailed as the realm's savior once again, though he privately harbored concerns about the future. He had narrowly averted a bloody fiasco. The realm was secure, but it was no longer uncontested Targaryen territory. House Ealer, with its scholarship and its silver dragons, loomed as an enigma. House Maegor, though broken, still simmered with resentment in the stepstones. Aegon's own mortality pressed upon him. When he passed the throne to his heir, would that heir be strong enough to keep these rival houses in line? Years flowed on. Aegon eventually died, as did Visenya and Rhaenys. The next generation of Targaryens inherited the Iron Throne. House Maegor languished on Bloodstone, their few surviving dragons rumored to be savage but uncooperative, a reflection of their wounded pride and diminished resources. House Ealer, on the other hand, prospered quietly. They took no direct part in the faith-militant uprisings or other regional conflicts, content to remain a scholarly presence in Oldtown, quietly cultivating alliances and wealth. Their knowledge of dragons grew, and so did their mastery of Valyrian lore. Some say they even uncovered secrets about the Doom itself, though they kept such discoveries hidden in cryptic manuscripts. Generations later, historians would debate the wisdom of Aegon's choice to let House Ealer remain autonomous. Some argued that it was a prudent way to avoid a war on two fronts. Others claimed it allowed a new power to take root in the south, one that could one day outmaneuver the Targaryens. What all agreed upon was that the presence of two additional Dragonlord houses forever changed the tapestry of Westeros. It was no longer a simple story of Targaryen conquest. Rather, it became a delicate dance among dragons, with each house seeking to preserve and extend the glories of a dead empire, each carrying pieces of that ancient Valyrian heritage. Yet the question lingered: would that heritage lead them to greatness, or would it ultimately consume them in another fiery doom? For now, the realm found itself in a tenuous equilibrium, one that might endure for decades or collapse in a single day of dragonfire. House Targaryen retained the Iron Throne, House Maegor nursed its wounds in the Stepstones, and House Ealer cultivated knowledge and influence in Oldtown. The lords of Westeros learned to navigate this new reality, forging alliances and nursing grudges. Above it all, dragons soared on thermals, their distant roars echoing across the fields and seas, a testament to the living legacy of a civilization once thought lost. And while the future remained uncertain, one undeniable truth had emerged. The Targaryens were no longer alone in claiming Valyria's mantle. The blood of the dragon ran deeper and wider than Westeros had ever imagined, weaving new threads of destiny that threatened to remake the realm again and again.